All right. So this is a session on an architect's guide to managing a code base. How many people in the room are architects? Out of curiosity. Okay, so you're in the right place, most likely. For the other people who didn't raise your hand, what are your job function or job title or whatever? Anybody? Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, it's fine. Go ahead, just shout it out. It's fine. Manager on architects. Oh, manager of architects. Oh, this will be fun. Okay. Anybody else? Do we have anybody? Yeah, go ahead. Yeah. Just software engineer. Okay, that's fine. Is anybody do DevOps or work with architects? Okay, so a few people. Okay, cool. So this is not normally I do a session where I basically just jump straight into an IDE and start writing code. This is a little bit different. This session is meant to be a little bit more interactive. So if you have any questions, or for that matter, any comments, or if you want to chime in on how you do some of these things as we go through it, please, by all means, don't wait till the end to ask questions or shout out comments. You can do it anytime during the session. I think the session is 90 minutes long, 75 minutes long. How long is it? 1.5 hours. Is it 1.5 hours? I don't remember. Usually Jay does 90 minute sessions. And this one is, it's only 75 minutes. Okay. All right. So my name is Pratik Patel. I'm a Java champion based out of Atlanta, Georgia. You may have read one of the books I've written over the years. I also help with the Atlanta Java User Group, and we run a big enterprise conference in Atlanta out of the nonprofit Java User Group, or JUG, called DevNexus, which is in the first week of March. You guys should check it out. It's usually 12 tracks, 120, 130 speakers, and it's a low-cost community conference. It's the first week of March next year, and Atlanta is known for what type of cuisine? Let's start with quizzes on this side. Anybody know? What's Atlanta famous for? Brave. Well, they're the Cobb County Braves, no longer the Atlanta Braves. That's a little bit of a bitter taste, but we'll talk about that over beer later. They moved out of the city and they're out in the suburbs now. Chicken and waffles, of course, right? So also many other things. But the most important thing on this slide is my Twitter / Blue Sky / LinkedIn handle. So if you have any questions or comments or just want to connect on LinkedIn, it's linkedin.com/in/Pierre Patel. Okay, similar for Twitter and for Blue Sky. Okay. And I do work at Azul. I think I'm wearing the official shirt today. We have a booth over here. We have Lego sets. Sorry, we're not allowed to call them Lego sets. They're brick build sets. They're very similar to something called Legos. And call them Legos for copyright reasons. So please swing by. And one of the tools that we'll talk about is a great tool that we have called Code Inventory. But if you're running on the JVM, you should ditch whichever JVM you're running and use one of ours because they're way better than the other companies out there. How many people are Java devs in here, out of curiosity? Okay, how many people are not Java devs? Anybody? Okay, so what do you know programming? Python. Okay, I'm still getting used to that whole white space means something thing. But anyway, you same thing. JavaScript. Okay, JavaScript's not bad. The first 4 letters are good at least. So, anybody else? Yeah, go ahead. C#. Okay, C# also a fine programming language. So this session is actually kind of platform neutral. So it doesn't matter if you program in JavaScript or in C# or Python or something more esoteric. It's fine. Anyone do anything like Camel or with Clojure, run Lisp on production? Anyone do any fancy stuff like that? Occasionally you see people who use stuff like that. Anyways, let's go on with the show here. Right. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this at the end. Azul Code Inventory is something, I assume all of you are here because, this is the Open Rewrite Conference or Moderna Open Rewrite Conference. We actually have a great integration with Open Rewrite that helps you identify and do a staged removal of dead and unused code, right? So you don't have to just guess, are we using this? And the reason why this is so important, or eliminating used codes, eliminating unused code is it leads to lower maintenance and tech debt over time. And how many people were at the keynote yesterday morning? Pretty much everyone, right? So we were actually talking about this at the booth yesterday. The phrase that the speaker used was, help me out here, Joe, capacity recovery. Capacity recovery. All right, I really like the way that was phrased. Oh, actually, the keynote speaker is here. Okay, perfect. Now I get to totally butcher your keynote. Is that okay? But I actually we really like that phrase because as a longtime software developer or architect or whatever, you realize that there's all this stuff that you build up over time, and you end up spending basically technically you end up spending so much time trying to just maintain this code and what does it do and the person who wrote it left 12 years ago and all that kind of fun stuff, right? But if you can, like Doug was saying, if you can use any tool to get capacity recovery, i.e., the size of your team doesn't change. The amount of work you do as a team doesn't change. But if you can get some time back to work on other stuff, or maybe just take a vacation occasionally, that's great, right? So we'll get into that later. I'm going to skip the slide where I talked about it. So the first thing I want to talk about, and I think this is a journey that anyone who's an architect or is thinking about becoming an architect will understand and kind of relate to very strongly, which is are software architects also software developers or programmers? I use the word programmers very specifically here. Software development means a lot of different things, right? How many, like, if I were to ask the people in this room, how much time do you spend actually writing code? What would your answer be? Okay, so let's start from the bottom. 0 to 20% as a software developer or architect. Okay, how about 20 to 40% actually writing code? Okay, 40 to 60. Okay, 60 to 80, 80 to 100. Right. So we kind of the middle there was about like 50%, right? And that makes sense. You understand that there's so many other things that you have to do as a software developer. That's why I use the word programmer here, right? People who actually write code, maintain code, and spend a lot of time in code. All right. So one of the first answers to this is it depends on your company. Every company views software architects slightly differently, right? At the place I used to work at and be a software architect, which was AT&T, it's a very large company. There are lots of teams. There were 1,000 Java developers on my floor alone in Atlanta, my building, that were software developers or part of the software development process. And they had a very formal way of looking at architects, and they had delineation between like who's an architect and who are just like software developers, programmers, etc. And it wasn't a hard delineation or line in the sand. It was gray areas between those kinds of things. A lot of it depends on the company. And when you arrive somewhere, what's the culture like? And also, how do they view architects? What are the responsibilities of architects and things like that, which we'll talk about in a few minutes to give you a better idea. And maybe you can think about how it works at your company. Right? It also depends on your role, right? So there's a lot of places, a lot of my friends who are software developers also wear the hat of an architect. So it's very much role dependent sometimes too. Again, it depends on the company. And thirdly, a lot of it also depends on you. Right? So there are people who are very comfortable just being a software architect, and I say this jokingly, of course, drawing sticks in boxes, as they say, right? Drawing diagrams. What's the modeling language? The unified modeling language, UML, that people used to use years ago. Do people still use that? Anybody know? Oh, kind of. Okay. Yeah, I remember. What was the software? This is so long ago. The Rational Rows. Does anybody remember that? Yeah. So I think we use different tools as architects today, but the point is a lot of it also depends on you and like what's your specific skill set or interest for that matter. I know when I was an architect, I spent actually a significant amount of time either coding or reviewing code, and then my other 50% of the time actually doing high-level architecture, and then the other 50% managing management, right? So it was a very challenging and a large company with a very large monolithic software product. So this naturally leads to the question, what does a typical software architect do, right? And again, this varies from company to company. So usually the first one is almost prevalent for every type of software architect, which is you do system design and implementation to some degree, but it's around system design and architecture. So it's thinking about the bigger picture and sometimes diving in deep into the nuts and bolts all the way down to the code, right? So this is part of this session. One of the things I did quite heavily when I was an architect, I was an architect for almost a decade with AT&T. I started off as a developer, but I caused too much trouble, so they took me off of development and moved me on to doing what we call DevOps today initially. So one of the things that I spent quite a bit of time on was also looking at technology selection, right? When I first got to AT&T, they were using Java EE with basically just straight Java EE, with no plumbing around it. One of the first things I tried to get the teams to implement very quickly was using the Spring framework. So I'm like, why are we writing all this low-level code? Why are we, basically every team was writing little utility classes, i.e. something that you see in the Spring framework for like things as rudimentary as dependency injection to externalizing resources and settings and things like that. Everyone was developing in their own way on teams. And I was like, well, it's always fun to build your own in-house framework. And, you're like, yeah, I built like something just like Spring framework and it's amazing. And I've worked as a consultant at places where they do that. And it's incredibly annoying because everyone thinks they're great framework builders, right? As a software developer, it's like, yeah, I can build a framework like Spring framework and it's going to have abstractions and things like that. But as you know, everyone in this room who's coded knows that it's extremely difficult to write a general purpose framework. Right? It's just extremely hard to get every use case and have proper layers of abstraction and things like that. Recently, I've been doing stuff with artificial intelligence. So how many people have heard of LangChain4j before? Right. So a few people. Basically, it's a library for calling generative AI models and doing other things like that. But as I started with it, I was like, wow, I'm having a lot of trouble understanding how to use this properly and like do like things a little bit differently or, implement things which I thought would be pretty simple. And so I called up some of my friends and I said, I'm using this LangChain4j thing. I'm finding it really hard to get my head around like how to use it properly. And they're like, yeah, pretty much it's not a great framework because they have too many layers of abstraction in it, right? They hide things so far down that you need to do something like inject a system message into a call for a generative AI LLM model, like dig beneath the surface and like kind of work around the framework. Anyways, my point is that with technology selection is a crucial part of being an architect, picking what tools you're going to use. So, if you're an architect in this room, the best thing that you can do for your company while you're here is come to the Azul booth, let Eric do a demo of code inventory. You'll take that tool back and you'll be a rock star. Okay. So, anyways, you definitely come and check out our demo of that. But like the example that I was telling you about, like the Spring framework, one of the reasons I wanted to bring that in is I wanted to unify the way that we did abstractions and use utilities across our entire code base. Again, the thousands or so development people just in our building, right? And after that, I spent probably most of my time at AT&T working on the third bullet here, which was performance concerns. We had a huge system based around Java and JEE. It was running on Sun Niagara chipsets, which is, if you remember, going back about 10 or 15 years, it's very wide but very slow clock speed processors. But we, better or worse, we were married to Oracle, and we used their hardware was Sun at the time. But I spent a lot of time working on performance concerns, and I basically built and led a performance lab there to make sure that our stuff worked. Because the stuff that I was working on was not, it wasn't like stuff for a hospital. But if our system went down, there'd be a technician in the field at your house trying to install UVerse or, TV service or phone service, and they wouldn't be able to do anything if our system was down. So it was an extremely critical system. And, we were trying to go for 3 nines of uptime and stuff like that. So, anyways, other things that software architects do, setting internal guidelines and best practices. I spent a lot of time doing this actually. And, this is everything from what kind of code style do you use. Nowadays, everyone uses basically 1 or 2 different code styles, which are commonly known and used across the industry. Many years ago, it wasn't necessarily like that, but we set guidelines for what tools you should use, what frameworks you should use, what are the coding guidelines, and other things like that. And the last 2 are more soft skill type of items, but they're probably equally as important as everything else. So I feel like one of the major things that an architect can do to help a company or help a team or across teams is the collaboration portion. So you would have teams working on different parts of the software. How do they collaborate? How do they know what other services could be called? How did you do documentation and those kinds of things? Okay. And finally, there's this leadership aspect. As a software architect, you have to have a fair amount of respect across the teams that you work on, so that they buy into the types of decisions that you make. Nowadays, we use what's the phrase? Agree to disagree or something like that. I don't know. Something in commit. Anyways, I can't remember exactly the phrase, but leadership is a key skill of being a software architect. A lot of that has to do with the fact that you interface with business owners and also with management. And of course, dealing with management can be a lot of fun. I use, fun in quotes. So, when someone in management now, I told you. Well, actually, here's a question for you. How many people think that a really, really good software developer, right? Because when you go into this tech world and you choose that as your career, you start off as a junior developer and mid developer, senior, principal developer. And then typically the next jump is one of two things. It's either become an architect or become a manager. Now, how many people think a really good software always or usually makes a really good manager? Right. Nobody does. But why is that? Why is that like kind of the thing that happens with upper management? They're like, you're a great developer. Why don't you manage this team of people now? It's like, that's a totally different skill set, right? But unfortunately, it's still prevalent nowadays that upper management thinks that people who are really good, at their job as a software developer will also make a good manager, even though they're completely different skill sets. Similarly for principal or similarly for architects. So here's a question. How removed should a software architect be from coding? And of course, this is a trick question because based on everything I said before, it depends. It depends on all the things that we talked about previously. What does your company's internal culture and process look like? What is the role definitions at the place that you're working at? And again, it also depends on you. Okay, but let's dive into this a little bit. So here's some reasons why an architect should code. And we'll get to the other part in a second. All right, so maintaining technical proficiency and credibility are at the top of this list. If you're an architect and you're working with a team of coders, being able to understand, for example, what's in the latest version of Java, should we be using records in our code base? Should we use Open Rewrite to go and convert all of our DTO type objects into records? What's the decision-making process behind that? If you're not familiar, records is something that came out in Java 17, so it's about 2 or 3 years old now. But one of the great things about records is it helps reduce the amount of code you write, and it also helps with other things, including performance, right? So a lot of people don't understand the performance part of it. But again, as an architect, when you think about these things, right, there's always a new version of Java or Python or JavaScript or whatever, and they're introducing new things. And as an architect, if you're a coding architect, one of the things that you would be involved in or maybe even driving is, should we use some of these new features, right? So when Java 8 came out and Lambdas came out, for example, that was an obvious yes. It's like, we need to use this because it'll help reduce the amount of code we write and makes code more expressive. It gives us a little bit more looser coupling and still maintains high cohesion. Right. So as an architect, these are the kinds of things that I think about when I was running a team of software developers. Is this something, these are new language features. Using new language features means you have two choices. You can either start using them for existing projects and just bolt them on as you go. You can convert old code, or you can just ignore them and not use them, right? So how do you make that decision, right? So this is something in terms of why an architect should code. One of the reasons why, because then you can make those kinds of decisions. But you don't have to. If you have people on dev teams who are really sharp developers, you can say, hey, let's talk about using something like records and using, for example, the following function API in new version of Java or whatever the feature may be, right? So you can trust people on the team that are good and stay on top of this and use them and leverage them to help you make these types of decisions. Now, the other thing is understanding implementation challenges and trade-offs. So this could be all the way down at the library level to the actual code level. So one of the other presentations I give is on a portion of it contains how do you write high performance Java, right? Or it could be JavaScript or Python. So you have to understand, okay, we use this kind of technique, do things down at the code level. It makes our code faster, but it decreases readability. Is that a trade-off worth doing? And then if we look at library and other libraries and other things like that, what happens if we bring in this library, right? Should we use LangChain for J to make calls to generative AI models, or should we use Spring AI? Right. So these are the kinds of things in terms of understanding implementation challenges and trade-offs. And of course, the last thing is that if you are an architect of codes, you can lead by example, and it gives you that level of respect with your development team, so that they feel like you actually know what you're doing, and you're not just drawing sticks and boxes and bossing people around. All right, so covered why you should consider being a coding architect. There are also reasons for architects not to code. So on the team that I worked at AT&T, there were about 10 people on this architecture team, and there were some people who literally all they did was sticks and boxes. But those people were necessary because they looked at things from a very high level and worried about integration between 24 different independent systems and how these systems call each other, even though they were part of the same overall application, right? So that person was not able to get into coding, or those 2 or 3 people were not able to really dive deep into the coding aspect because they had time constraints and needed to focus on those high-level concerns, right? And I did a lot of this too towards the end of my stint there, because I focused very heavily on performance concerns. So I couldn't get down and look at all the bits of code that people wrote, but I would run tools that would help me highlight problematic areas of code, and then I would do code reviews, but I didn't spend a lot of time doing that necessarily because I was focused on the bigger picture around performance, which is more at the systems level than all the way down at the coding level. Okay. So another reason why our architects should not code is you run this risk of micromanagement, right? And everyone is guilty of this. I have this saying that software developers are extremely conservative when it has to do with basically deploying and running things on production, right? So this is one of the things at Azul I spend some time with customers with is software developers will want to over provision a system that their software is running on. Why? Because they don't want that thing to go down when it's running on production, because guess who gets called up eventually, right? The software developers will get called up like, wow, the system has just crashed because of some reason. Oftentimes it's because a system has been overly taxed and the JVM just locks up in GC thrashing or something like that. But on the other hand, software developers are actually very keen to use the latest library, right? Or you may have heard this term before called resume-driven development. It's like, ooh, there's this cool thing. Let's go use this new library, or let's. A few years ago, down at the coding level, everyone was into building stuff using reactive frameworks, right? Like Vertex and what's the Spring one called? Spring Reactor, I think, right? So everyone was like really hot and heavy building into that. But if you talk to folks who use those kinds of low-level reactive frameworks, or software developers specifically, they'll tell you that oftentimes they're not worth the extra effort you need to put in the verbosity of the code that it introduces. So my point is that sometimes you just want to let your senior developers or principal developers lead and let them figure out things like that and come to you with those types of solutions. And of course, if you have to worry about potential bias, and if you're a software developer and you really like certain frameworks or certain ways of doing things, you may imprint that on your software dev team, and that may not be the best thing to do. Okay. All right. So it's essential for software architects to maintain a strong understanding of coding principles and practices, regardless of whether they code or not. So in the last 2 slides, we talked about why architects code and why they should not code. But I think this sums everything up here, right? If you're an architect, you should at least know what's happening all the way down to the code level and have understanding of it. Java 17, for example, introduced records, which I just talked about. Is that something we should use? The architect should be at least part of that conversation if they don't intimately understand the rationale for using something like records in Java. Okay, should we convert our code base for these microservices to use records, or should we just leave that alone and everything new uses records when they need data transfer type of objects and things like that? Okay. All right, so let's move on. Oh, there's one more. I forgot about this one. Level of coding involvement should be tailored to the specific context of the project and the architect role. So I've already talked about this quite a bit, but I did want to summarize this section of the presentation so that we can move on. Okay. Open collaboration, we talked about this already. Open collaboration, communication and collaboration between architects and developers are crucial to ensure that decisions are aligned with implementation reality. And I think the biggest thing here is the implementation realities part, right? You can't just go and use certain things because sometimes it just won't work. All right, so let's get into some of the things that you can actually do to help with this coding process as either a developer or an architect. We'll talk about architecture and code, look at processes, and check out some tools. All right, so question. How do software architecture patterns help produce better software and code? All right, so this is a common question. Everyone is familiar with low-level patterns like the Yang 4 patterns, observer, and things like that. But there are also high-level software architecture patterns. I've been giving a talk for a while on like enterprise cloud patterns, right? There's a whole bunch of patterns at the cloud level now in terms of how to build systems which are cloud native and work well on the cloud, right? But this is the slide that I like to reference when I'm thinking about software architecture and code. Okay. So we want to have a solid foundation where all the devs are on the same page and create some kind of knowledge base across a team so that everyone is working in lockstep. A few years ago, there was this whole thing about the 10x developer, right? You probably read about this or saw it on Twitter or whatever, right? Yes, some people are just like 10x developers, but the conversation very quickly shifted from yes, you have like these rock star developers, but are they really 10x developers? The way that we like to think about this now is not 10x developers, but 10x teams. And I think this is where a software architect really can help with something like this. We're keeping developers on the same page in terms of everything from the way that you write code, how you do unit tests, what tools you use, and having a knowledge base for a system so that other people who consume that system internally or even externally for that matter have a very easy time of using whatever you build. Okay. So software architecture and coding. One of the other key things around this from a software architecture point of view is managing complexity and making sure that code is maintainable. And that leads directly to having less bugs and having low and high level reuse of code. So low level reuse is basically down at like the class or interface level. High level code reuse is all the way up. If you produce a library that's used internally, great. But typically nowadays that is done by API consumption or RESTful endpoints and things like that. So again, these are the kinds of things that I've thought about, still think about when I think about software architecture and code. What's at that intersection, right? We talked about this last thing a little bit already, which is a software architect is also able to help scale a team and a platform so that you can deploy faster and more often, and more crucially, can have more people on a team, right? So you all have heard of the axiom where adding an extra person to a team doesn't mean that you incrementally added more capacity to that team because of communication overhead, right? So if you go from 9 to 10 people on a team, you're not adding 10% more capacity to the team. It's actually much less than that because there's a lot of overhead in communication and other things like that. But if you have processes and tools in place, you can get close to getting linear addition of people to teams so that you can do more, especially when you have large projects or if you need to, move people between teams. All right. So let's talk about each one of these things in a little bit more detail. First thing that we had on the slide was solid foundation for code. And again, this is in the context of software architecture, right? We have developers working on the same tech stacks. Knowledge of the overall system and design is very useful, and then you have proven patterns at both at a high level. Now, the first one, nowadays, typically when people join a dev team, what do you guys use, like the onboarding in person? You say, okay, here's go to this GitHub repo, run this script, and it just installs everything for you? Or do you have like a document where someone new on a team even can get up to speed on? What do you guys use to do stuff like that? What's that? Documentation. Okay, you just have documentation. So you don't have like a repository where they go check it out, just goes and installs like all the stuff that they need. No, it's fine. No is a perfectly valid answer. Problem doing having a repo with the installation script is that someone has to maintain it, right? So who's going to maintain it? That's always becomes a big question. So anybody else use a different technique for that?
Page like video introduction about tools.
Oh, you actually produce videos to help developers learn the internal tools and processes and things like that. Nice. How big are the teams that you have there?
Around
Around 15. Okay, that's a reasonable amount of folks, or actually, that's a large team nowadays, at least. So, okay, cool. Is there any other things that folks use to like help with this process of onboarding or people switching teams? Yes.
Yeah, for new folks, we usually do like a shadow or like a buddy system. So I mean, we have documentation as well, but it helps even just it's just for a day, someone directly.
Okay. I got you. So the answer was that you kind of have new people shadow, people who are already in the team. Yeah, it's actually a great idea. Anyone still do pair programming out of curiosity?
yeah.
Some a little bit. Some teams do. Okay, that's interesting. That was in vogue for a long time, and a lot of people swore by it. But I was just curious to see.
A lot of people remote now. It's not quite as effective.
Yeah. Yeah, actually, gentlemen in the back brings up a really good point. Is that now with remote working, that becomes a little bit more difficult. I've seen some tools that allow you to pair program remotely, but it's not the same as sitting next to somebody and actually coding up something.
And you have to learn those tools. Well,
Right.
you don't know about it. You can't use
Yep, exactly. So, right. So that's the kind of devs working on the same tech stack and using the same tools so that they can help each other. And knowledge of overall system design. We talked about this already. But the software architect will be able to produce documentation or other things that allow developers to know the overall system and design. One thing that I've done for my team at where I work is we don't do a lot of coding, but one of the things that I set up is I took a lot of the documentation, other notes that I have for like things like our weekly team meetings, for example. This is like our policy for like how you submit papers into conferences and other things like that. And I put them into this really nifty tool from on Notebook LM. Have you guys seen this tool, Notebook LM? If you haven't, you should go look at it. It's an incredible tool where you basically say, here's a bunch of documents or YouTube video or whatever. And then you can actually, it's like any other kind of generative AI thing. It's kind of not every other thing, but very similar. Then you can actually go and query it. And like, so sometimes I'll just forget. It's like, okay, where is, like, what's our internal policy for, how I book hotels or something like that, right? It's part of my team travels a lot. So I can actually go to this Notebook LM and I have the Azul employee and travel handbook uploaded into it. I can just ask it, what's our travel policy for booking hotels? Or it could be something else like, when are the end of quarter metrics due for me personally or for the team? And it'll actually spit all those answers out. So it's a really nice tool called Notebook LM, a way to build up like your own internal knowledge base without actually having to build a system. You just feed it a whole bunch of stuff and so. Okay, and then finally, we have proven patterns, low and high level for different types of code we use. We talked about this already, so we're just going to move on. Yeah. All right, so one of these things I think an architect can help with in terms of software development is a good architect can help lead to lower bugs in code, right? And there's several different ways that this can be sliced. So one of the things I did is I spent a lot of time doing code. I didn't write all the code, but I did a lot of code reviews because I was specifically charged with performance types of things across the entire system, right? So this is like basically 24 different applications which were running as monoliths, so they weren't microservices, each large. So I would go to each team's code review and sit in on the code reviews and when necessary, give them advice on avoiding common low-level code problems, right? There's lots of different things around the streaming and other things like that. And This is a great story. I was in a code review once, and the developer was scrolling past some of the code. We were using an automated tool called Sonar Cube, which I won't mention in a bit, but basically code quality tool. And it flagged some in this code, but somewhere in the code, he had a system.exit in it. And I'm like, why is there a system.exit? And this is not like a batch script, right? This is basically, if you're familiar with the technology, it was an EJB, Enterprise Java Bean or EJB. I was like, this should not be here. He's like, oh, no, I just use this for testing on my local desktop, right? I'm like, are you sure this is never going to be called, right? And his answer was, no, of course not. It only gets called when I call it with this specific thing. And I was like, okay. I was like, but just please remove it, right? It's making me feel not well that this is in the code, right? So anyways, a little time goes by, and then of course on Saturday morning at about 2 a.m. I get a phone call that the server just went down. They just did a deployment of, we used a waterfall methodology, very, very advanced, very cutting edge software development technology. So every 4 months we did a release. Anyways, there was a release that evening. I wasn't on call. Somebody else on my team was. But I got a call. They're like, this system keeps crashing. Can't figure it out. What's going on? Right. As soon as they bring it up and push some traffic to it, it would just crash. Not like, within a minute, it would be just randomly crashing. And then eventually I figured out that it was that block of code that person had written. Right. And I actually called him up, right? As there's 3 a.m. I was like, did you remove that code? I knew the answer, but I just want to be an asshole for a second, right? Because I was awoken at 3 a.m. by this guy. And he's like, oh, no, I haven't done it yet. Oh, did that get shipped to production? I'm like, yes, you know this. We don't release every day. We release once every 4 months. So you know what I did? I went and removed that code, put it back and rebuilt that EJB module, put it back in, and everything started working. So that was fun. My point here with that story is that being involved in the code review process, for me specifically, for the kind of architect role that I had, was actually really useful because I was able to spot those kinds of things. I was able to see when people were doing sprints, like basically doing string concatenation, like over and over. I'd say, no, don't do that. Use string templating to produce like strings, because strings, as you know, in any programming language, use a lot of memory, and it's specifically in Java or in C# for that matter. Having a lot of memory means you do a lot of garbage collection, which has an impact on performance, right? So, okay. So I didn't spend a lot of time on low-level code reuse, but this is something that I would flag when someone wrote some code that looked really similar, especially utility code that looked really similar to something else. We would try to combine it, use our overall code footprint by doing something like that. And of course, as an architect, you will typically be very involved in high-level code reuse. When I was at AT&T, we used 3 different ways of communicating between systems. The primary was just using messaging system like JMS that would send a message to another system that would get processed by that, and then another part of the app get a JMS message, right? Typical kind of message-driven architecture type of thing. But we also did RESTful calls, and God help us, we also use SOAP because when business analysts convinced our management that we should use what's it called? It's like a 4-letter word. It's almost as bad as the F word. BPEL, BPEL. You guys remember that? Right? Business process expression language. Thank you. Yeah, I'll purge those dark days from my memory. But anyway, those were the 3 different types of ways that we communicated. Thankfully, that BPEL project lasted for about a year, and then we made up points that it was not doing what it was supposed to do and added too much complexity that we got rid of it. We didn't get rid of the person who suggested that and drove that and probably got a kickback to bring in a vendor, but that's a different story. So, better told over here. Okay. All right. So the last thing in that diagram that I had up previously is scale teams, right? So software architect can help with better code quality means that you get faster releases. Most people still don't, most people do deployments, weekly, monthly, daily. So how many people, actually, that's a good question. How many people deploy multiple times a day to production? Anybody? Okay, so a couple folks. How about once a day? Okay, once a week? Okay, once a month? Oh, what? once every few months, let's say 6 months. Okay? How about once a year? Anybody? Once every 5 years. Yeah, I mean, you never know, right? Okay, so we've talked about these things already, so we'll move on. Well, the second thing is also interesting. Better code quality means that more people can work on the same code, which is especially useful if you ever want to take a vacation or something like that. So, yeah. So let's dive into some of the different processes around this. So what I did for this section is it's been a while since I've been a software architect. Even though I still do a lot of software architecture where I work in kind of different ways. So I went and asked a bunch of my friends who were in these specific roles. I said, what kind of processes and other things do you use to help your overall kind of system development, software development, but specifically down from the software architect to the code level? And so I'll distill these into 6 points for you. Right. So I already talked about the first one, which is, and we talked a little bit about if software architects should get involved in code reviews, right? So that's why I have a question mark there. Coding guidelines was one of the big things. And this went all the way from coding guidelines to like system design guidelines, right? We use REST. How do we do versioning, for example, right? Do we stick to the common nomenclature way of doing it? What do we do with code that belongs to an older version? How long should a older versioned API live? Because that code should probably be removed at some point so that you have less overall technical debt. Sometimes that's not possible. You may have someone calling your V1 of your API, even though you're on V15, and you can't get that other team to use the new API, so you're just kind of stuck with it, right, or whatever. And then, of course, around processes, I spoke about this a bit already, performance testing and reviews of overall performance. So a lot of folks do some kind of performance testing. Of course, it depends on your application, right? If you are sensitive to, if you need low latency, if you need high throughput, if you have bursty kind of traffic, this is important, but there's an entire process around performance testing and reviews. If you're interested in diving deep into how I do performance reviews or how I do performance reviews and how I set up a performance architecture, please reach out. I'm happy to do that over Zoom for you or come to your office and do it. But I have a great session on this that dives deep into like overall performance testing architecture is the best way to put it. So, good. All right. So in terms of tech and library selection, one of the things that I did is that no libraries could be used without approval. Part of that was I didn't want folks to just start using stuff and then it's one of those things. You start using a library and other folks on the team start using it. Now all of a sudden you're dependent on it, but it may not be something that you want to use. I was working with a customer about a year and a half ago, and they were very concerned about using a new version of a library because the library had changed its terms from being open source to, well, it's still open source, but now you got to pay for anything that's beyond version 4.7, right? So this is something that you don't want going in trouble with in terms of legal and compliance reasons, because someone can sue you, and being the person why your company got sued, probably not a good way to retain your job, right? So, but I spent a lot of time looking at different types of libraries. People would come to me and say, "Hey, we want to use Axios to do SOAPful endpoints. Is this a good idea or not?" Right? And then my first question to that would be, do we really need to use SOAP to do this, right? Can we not just use Corba? I'm joking, by the way, for the old Java people in here who remember Corba and doing RMI. But anyways, you get the idea. Standard libs are very important, and also deciding on which specific version of standard libraries is something we spend a lot of time on. And this can be extremely difficult because, especially nowadays, you get a lot of transitive dependency. You include this library in your Maven or Gradle or whatever tool you use for your project, right? If you're using JavaScript, you use NPM, and all of a sudden it sucks in all these other libraries. Are they the standard ones, right? And you might be thinking, well, this is a little nitpicky that you're concerned about which specific version of a third-party library you're using, but this directly relates primarily to security concern, right? So you probably remember from a few years ago, there was a massive security hole in the Log4j library, which ruined a lot of people's Christmas that year because it was a big gaping hole in the system. But this is why it's standardized, not just standardizing across libraries, but also specific versions was super important, is super important as an architect, right? Or as a developer. And pretty much everyone has standard CI and CD deployment practices nowadays, which is good. This can be a little bit challenging. I have some friends who are specifically DevOps architects, so they just focus on the DevOps side of things. How do we make a build pipeline run fast? How do we make sure that build pipelines don't cost too much money? You might be thinking, well, what do you mean they cost too much money? Well, every time you want to build, if you're running in the cloud, it's going to cost you money, right? How often do we do builds? How often do we promote builds to go to integration testing, for example, because that takes a lot of resources. So I have some friends who spend quite a bit of time just optimizing these kinds of things, right? Especially nowadays with containers, the impact that having that you can have on a CI pipeline or a CD pipeline is huge. If you rebuild a container every time you do a code release, how often do you update things inside of it? Are there special things that need to be done? Other things like that. So along with this, one of the things that myself and other architects do is we spend a fair amount of time publishing architectural designs. Writing documentation is not fun for anybody, but having at least some basic designs that are always up to date were crucial to making sure, whether it's a microservice or a monolithic type system with multiple dozens of monoliths that talk to each other, it's critical to keep things, keep everything going. All right, so this is the last section. We're going to talk about tools for a bit. Now, this tool list is not comprehensive. So what I will ask you is, as I'm going through this, if there's another tool that you like using, please share. Happy to give you a voice and help other folks in the room learn what are some of the tools. Now, everyone in this room probably uses Sonar for code quality, right? Does everyone know what Sonar is? If you're in the Java world, you probably have heard of it. I think it's also available for other platforms, such as JavaScript and Python. But Sonar is a collection of different tools that include things like find bugs and check style and things like that. This is something that most people run routinely across their code base. I assume everyone runs this across their code base, at least for code. Another tool that I like, especially as an architect, is surprisingly called JArchitect. I'm going to show you a screenshot of that in just a second. And then I'll talk about Azul code inventory very quickly at the bottom of this section. Okay. So this is a screenshot of Sonar. Again, what it does is it uses a number of different tools underneath the hood to give you metrics on what kind of problems you might have in your code. One of the things that I did very early on when I became an architect was I put this tool in and made it part of every code review. Before, people would just open up code and like, oh, this is all new code I've written. It was kind of unorganized. And I wanted to bring a little bit of structure to that. I'm not somebody who likes process or structure because I'm a software developer, and all software developers are cowboys, as you know, right? We like to do our own thing our own way. But I was like, we need a little bit of insight. And the other thing that I like something like this for is it gives me the ability to go back in time and to look at how the code has gotten worse or has gotten better over time, right? So one of the key things that for the teams that I worked with, one of the key things that I always told them is that mid-release is when I expect to see the most number of bugs and other issues, right? There's code smells and technical debt. But our goal every time was to drive those down as we approach the release. So I said, yes, it's fine. You're writing new code. You're going to have problems that you need to fix. So you kind of peak in terms of problems that you see in check style and find bugs and other things like that. But as you approach the end of the release cycle, those numbers should go down. Like they should be at least the same or less than the previous release. So putting this in as part of a CI/CD pipeline was super useful because I could go back and see well, when we did the last release, this is what everything looked like for the specific module in the project, and this is what it looks like now. These are things we need to improve, and other things like that. Now, there's one of the tools in this. I'm going to forget what it's called. I think it's called Clover, which does unit test code coverage, right? So for a while, that was like the big thing. Like, okay, we have this tool that allows us to see, and specifically to Clover. What's another tool that does test coverage nowadays? Which one? Okay, yeah. So whichever tool you use, right? And so initially, when one of our developers said, "Hey, this could really help with this," we started using it, and you can probably guess what happened, right? As we started using it and incorporating a code coverage tool as part of our code review process, what happened is that the dev team very quickly angled to having great test coverage, right? Which was good, or so you would think. But if you're not familiar with test coverage, or specifically code test coverage, you can never achieve 100%, right? There's this entire very true law of diminishing returns with this. You know, if you ask somebody, like if I were to ask you, right, well, what would be a good number for a code test, basically test coverage in your code? Yeah, there's not a good answer.
It's not a good answer, yeah. And it, like, no matter where you, in my experience, no
Yeah.
matter where you set that number, now the goal is the number,
Right.
and not the purpose of the test.
Right.
I think coverage can be a good, like, indicator in a generalized sense, but yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. So, 100%, it's a good tool to use just to make sure you have enough coverage around everything, but it doesn't measure the quality of the test. Right? It just means that this bit of code was run, right? And as you know from being a software developer, the types of inputs that you give into your code, sometimes they're generated. Maybe you're one of these fancy people using AI to generate tests for your code. Has anyone tried using any of these AI tools for generating tests yet? How does it work for them? I'm curious.
I think it's great, but you still need to go through and make sure that, you know, things are kosher.
Okay, which tool do you use out of curiosity?
I have been using G.
Junie, okay. There are some other people that raise their hand here. Anyone else want to chime in on which AI-driven test tool you use? No. Okay, that's okay. Yeah. So now you can generate. Now you don't have to write code to generate technical debt. You can just have AI generate it for you, right? I'm joking. But I'm glad your experience was good. I'll play around with some of them before. Yeah, these look good, but I'm going to wait for things to mature a bit before I try to use them for my own code, right? So, and you said you're using Junie, which is the plugin in IT. Is that right? Yeah. Gotcha.
Came not long ago.
What's that?
Junie just came not long ago.
Yeah. Junie was just released probably a month ago or something. So, yeah. But there are other companies that sell a very specific solution for writing unit tests. They kind of look at your code and just generate a unit test for you. Again, I don't know if they're useful, and I agree with your comment that you have to kind of look at it and see, yeah, this is useful, we should keep it or not. So, anyways, let's move on. All right, so this is another tool I like to use, right? This is more of a higher level tool. It's still at the code level, but it's called a JArchitect. And this screenshot is specifically from an application server called Wildfly. I just took it off their page because I didn't want to expose my proprietary information here. But you can see it gives you it can give you some things like code coverage and gives you method complexity metrics and other things like that. And it gives you the ability to look at the different modules or parts of the code in terms of packages, Java packages. So this is a nice tool that is useful kind of for gauging overall kind of complexity and like what are the different types of metrics that might be useful over time. I find this useful for doing like kind of end of cycle code reviews. So yeah, we're checking out called JArchitect. And then finally, this is something that we can do a demo for you at our booth. It's Code Inventory. Azul Code Inventory is something that goes and looks at the code that you're actually running in production and tells you what code is actually being executed on production, so that from that you can derive what code is not being used And what do you do with code that's not being used on production? You deprecate and then you eventually delete it, right? And part of the reason why we're here and talking about this specific tool is that it integrates with Open Rewrite. So what you can do is you can take your Open Rewrite, and it has access to your code. You run the same code in production with our Java agent. It's only for Java at this point in time. And you take that data, you put it into Open Rewrite, and there's a very lightweight process around how it will mark code that's not run in production with deprecated. You keep running it for a while longer, and then it could be marked for removal, and then Open Rewrite can actually go in and nuke that code for you if you want. Okay, so it's a really great integration. And with some of the customers that we have that have been using this, for example, one of the customers that's using this is a company you may have heard of called Netflix. Right? Anybody that watches streaming services has probably heard of them. They ran this across their thousands of microservices and found anywhere from 20 to 30% of code that they ship to production is not being used. So imagine if you could go in and reduce your technical debt by 20, 30, or 50%, right? We've seen other folks who run their code inventory in production find that 50% or more of their code, and this is for like not old legacy systems. These are like actively developed systems. That code is actually not being run. So they can reduce their technical debt very quickly and in a very safe way. It takes some time, of course. You run it on production, it gathers. These are all the jars, classes, methods that have been run. You collect this information over several weeks, and you want to be safe. So you might run it for 2 or 3 months, and then you start phasing that code out in a very risk-averse way.
Does this this is for a production environment?
Yes. Okay.
It needs any additional memory or any space?
Okay, so it's a good question. So the question is the code inventory is for a production environment. It doesn't have to be. You can run it like in a staging or QA environment. We recommend you run it in production. And the reason for that is that it's extremely low overhead, right? It's less than 1%, 0.5% overhead. So it's not like these other agent-based tools that are have a lot of overhead. It's very low overhead. It does produce some data, but it doesn't produce a huge amount of data, so it doesn't tax your system very much. Okay, and the reason why we recommend it running in production is because production usually is people are actually using it, right? So I have a T-shirt at home actually, which is I don't normally write tests. I don't normally test, or when I do test, I test on production. So, should have worn that shirt to me. I don't know what we should print those shirts out and put Azul on the back here. Give them out in cost. I think they'd be very popular. Anyways, this specific client is something done by one of the guys on my team. We have a web-based user interface that we can demo at our booth. But again, it has great integration with Open Rewrite. And from our customers who have actually run this in production, they are surprised at how much dead code it finds after they run it for weeks and months. Okay. Yes, go ahead.
So as you continue to release over the months, obviously your code profile changes. Does it give you additional information that allows you to know kind of versioning, or you have to kind of mentally map it back to?
Yeah. So that's a good question. The question is that, okay, so you run this for a while and, your code is not static. You're writing new code, you might be, refactoring code, things like that. So what we're able to do is we're able to tell you that the first time that this method or class or jar was called and the last time it was called, right? But the most recent, I think, is the best way to do it. So that can be used, and we don't want to provide you with yet another dashboard. We do give you a dashboard, so at least you can see initially how it works. But what we like for people to do is to hit the endpoint that contains the data, and then you pull the data into whatever way you want to do this, and then you can answer that question by you have the raw data that we collect for you, and then you can answer that question for yourself. I know that sounds a bit strange, but everyone, every system is different. The way everyone does process and deployment and management of code is different in every company. So we liberate you from having to be tied to our dashboard and just give you the raw data, and you can do exactly what you did. Like, for example, with that, the short answer for your question is yes, you can do that. It's not necessarily supported out of the box, but there's a bunch of stuff that is. But again, you pull the data and say, okay, this specific module, this jar, this class, this method, or let's just go down to the class level. It looks like it hasn't been run in a while, but we refactored some code and all of a sudden it showed up, right? So you can answer questions like that, right? And yes, it will eventually support AI. I'm joking, by the way. The product manager is here, he just had a heart attack. So everything has to have AI, right? You sprinkle a little bit of AI and everything, it makes everything better, right? So I have another session that I do, which is basically understanding AI and retrieval augmented generation. So if you'd like to see that, it's kind of starts from almost nothing in terms of AI, and I've given it a few times. I've gotten some good feedback on it. So that's something I'm happy to do to your dev team over Zoom or in person. So let me know, right? You can reach out to me over LinkedIn. So a couple other quick tools. I already talked about this last one. I'm not completely sold on this, but it looks like some people have had some decent luck with it. I don't like the idea of generating code to begin with, because it's just like I do a shitty enough job writing code. I don't need somebody else to write shitty code too and put it into my code base, right? And as you know, AI tools currently for either generating code or for code assistance, they are not perfect, right? I find them most useful currently just for doing small bits of code assistance, but like generating not wholesale, but even like small bits of code or medium size or even whole applications, we are not there, in my opinion. Does anybody have any different experience with using code generation using AI tools? Anyone like, yes, we use something and it's amazing. Yeah, which one?
Cursor.
Okay,
But I
Cursor.
thought for making a POC. So right, like a
Okay, yeah, for proof of concept. Which service or LLM are you using to drive Cursor? Are you using Gemini or Claude? Okay, yeah. So if you're not familiar, Claude Sonnet, Anthropic Claude Sonnet 3.7 is currently the gold standard in terms of an AI tool that helps you generate applications or helps generate code. Right? That sounds about right. Yeah. I've been using Gemini 2.5 Pro recently. That does an incredibly good job too. But a lot of this it depends on what you are building. Sorry, which platform you're building on. Okay. So I find that both Gemini and Sonnet are solid with Java code, even up all the way up to Java 17, Java 19. Really good, right? It'll generate amazing code that works well. And you can try this out. You can go to like Claude Sonnet and say, write an application that reads a CSV file and does. They'll be able to do that relatively easily in Java. Where I think these things break down, at least in my experience, is, for example, on the front end, I like to use Vue.js as my framework of choice for building front end projects. Anyone use Vue out of curiosity? Okay, yeah, Vue's great. React is good too, right? Not hating on any of those. But I find that these tools for generating or doing like more than just basic code assist doesn't work so great for JavaScript projects for some reason, right? Specifically front end JavaScript projects. It works better for things like Python and for Java for backend stuff. So a couple other tools that I like. There's a bunch of great performance tools that I use. I talked a lot about performance in here. So hear about this. I have a presentation I'm happy to do with you, but some of the tools I like for this, I use very simple tools like JMeter to drive traffic or Gapping to drive traffic. And then in the Java universe, at least, I just use some simple tools like taking thread dumps, not usually heap dumps, and using something like there are tools like EasyGC. Azul has a great free open source tool for analyzing garbage collection logs called GCLA, or Garbage Collection Log Analyzer, and that's a free tool we provide to everybody. Another performance tool that we have for Java projects is called basically called Jitter. It's a tool that allows you to see when there's like small to large pauses in the VM. You can correlate them to things like garbage collection or other events in your system.
And these tools are
when using your JDK?
No, they'll work with any JDK. So the question was, the tools, the JVM tools I just mentioned, are they only for Azul JVMs? The answer is no. They're you use them for any JVM. Okay? Like Jitter is a tool that you can use on OpenJDK or on Oracle JDK or whatever. Okay? And I just do this one up here for fun. This is something that I've been implementing some things with recently. It's called Restate. It's similar to temporal.io if you've seen that before, but if you do complex transactions, especially in the cloud, where you might span from like a serverless cloud function to some kind of database thing, or maybe using a Kafka broker, and like you need to weave these together and have some kind of transaction ability across things which are extremely loosely coupled and don't like relate to each other at all. I find Restate to be really nice for doing kind of complex transactions. So if you work in like, I don't know, something like a bank, and you have to make sure that things get transacted exactly. But this is a really nice scalable tool for doing asynchronous transactions that can run across the cloud. So, good. All right. And that is the end of this. Again, if you want to reach out, LinkedIn, Pratik Patel or Pratik Patel Atlanta will give you the first hit. I have a bunch of great presentations that I'm happy to do for you over Zoom or at your office. And you don't have to pay anything because that's part of my job. I don't work in sales. I lead the developer relations team at Azul Systems. So I'm happy to provide some free education for you. So I think we're at the end of time now. Thank you for coming. Hope you enjoyed the session. Stop by the Azul booth. We'll give you a quick demo to show you how code inventory works with open rewrite, since we're at the Open Rewrite Conference, right? Thank you for coming.